Hi. Oh my goodness. Hello.
Welcome, Joan. Do you want us to call you Joan? Do you want to go by Miss King? What works better? Because I know you might want to use this for your school as well.
Yes, I do plan on sharing this with coworkers and students, so Miss King would be best.
Okay, we'll call
Thank
you
you
Miss
for asking.
King. And I'm excited about today's conversation because it is an important one. Um, so before we really get into it too, I think it'd be helpful, Miss King, if you want to give us a little bit of a background of like how we came about even having this come up, like how I was like, oh, you should come to this conversation. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, oh my goodness, where do I start? Um, I think this all was triggered when I started looking at the statistics of discipline in education, and I mean, words don't really come to describe it, but I'd say just deeply disturbed because when we look at discipline in school and we look at the incarceration rates, there are clear patterns there, and the statistics don't lie. And what the statistics are communicating is that there are racial biases and blatant racism in our systems. So when I started looking at education specifically, so I am a high school teacher, I started really thinking hard about, I looked up that Black students are more likely to be disciplined in school, 3 times higher than their counterparts. And Black girls are actually disciplined at a rate of 7 times more likely. So I really started digging deep, and I've really been thinking hard about, I've noticed that with education, education seems to be shifting towards away towards zero tolerance policies, thinking that this would actually help a lot of the statistics, which on some level I do support, but I'm really wondering why we're not talking more about what's happening in the classroom, like before they're actually in the office. What's going on there? So it's funny because am I calling you Giselle or Miss what? Whatever. Okay.
My last name is Willicky, but you can call me whichever you want.
I knew Giselle a long time ago when she wasn't married, so this is tricky for me. So Giselle and I had a conversation, and she mentioned something like that Asian students and white students school tends to kind of cater towards that demographic, which is sit down, be quiet, do your work. And this suddenly, like, something clicked in my head, and I was like, we need to start having a conversation around first off, why we perceive Black kids as being disruptive. Why are we suddenly labeling them as loud? Why do we consider loud being disruptive? So these are the questions I want to kind of explore with all of you today, and what you've experienced on a firsthand level, if you're willing to share that with me, and what exactly is going on, and maybe perhaps even some advice that you'd have for other educators.
Awesome, thank you. So team, we can keep that order for answering questions just so it won't get awkward, like waiting for someone to unmute themselves. But if you wanted to like pass, if you feel like what's been shared has already been shared, you feel free to just say pass. But we'll just keep that order just for like the sake of keeping the flow going. So let's just talk about that piece of it, right? Like the idea of like school being catered towards a certain demographics, and let's talk about that. Like, how do you all feel about that? Have you felt that way? Do you think that's accurate or not so much? Share your thoughts on that piece of it. And we'll start with you, Kayla.
Yeah, I think it's definitely accurate that school caters towards like that demographic for sure. I would say with my experience, like we kind of talked about it in like earlier conversations, but like being like kind of seen as like that token Black student, I feel like that was like more my experience in education. So I yeah, I don't know. That's kind of all I have to say for right now. But I definitely agree that that's like definitely what school caters towards, and it's a problem.
I think I agree with. I think school caters towards that demographic as well too, and I like from my experience, it was just being a black kid, just like in my personal life at home, like we were always rowdy and running around. We were always wrestling each other, or just like energetic. So whenever we go to school and just sit down all day, just to do work and all of that, and we don't really have it's not like we're not we were definitely disciplined, but it was just we were more free to do get that energy out and express that energy, and then we go to class and just have to sit there. Then it's different. We're gonna get chippy or do whatever we can to get those little spurts of energy out. So yeah, that's one reason why I think it's that way too.
Yeah, just to second what Michael was saying, that was, growing up for me, I was always like rowdy too in class, and received, get reprimanded for, talking more, being talkative. But in terms of like the schoolwork, I was still getting all the schoolwork done and was still performing well. Um, but it just was my personality that I wanted to do things that were more tactile, more interactive. And so I think it's important when, especially a teacher's learning or a teacher's teaching style doesn't incorporate those diverse forms of learning methods that a lot of kids have, which, not for everybody, or not particularly Black students, but just people generally that want to learn through tactile methods or interactive. Um, Making sure to incorporate those things is definitely important. And yeah, that's all I have to say on that for now.
I think, I don't know. I think it definitely is catered towards those type of students. And I think that's like the standard or the norm that you're supposed to like be meeting. And even like for me, like I've always been, like Kayla said, like kind of like the token kid, but I talk a lot. And so like I remember just like I've learned how to talk and do my work at the same time. And so even I think it was this year, my teacher had to like split up my friends and I because I would always talk, but I assumed they were doing what I was doing, like they were doing their work and talking, but like they weren't, and I didn't know that. So it's just like, I think there's certain, I don't really know. I think it's certain kids work better in that type of environment because that's how it is at home. Like I know my family's naturally loud. We sing all over the house. We talk loud. We talk in front of people. So I think that's, and with having siblings too, I think a lot of Black families have a big dynamic. I don't think it's always just, like one kid and their parent. I think, you're always around your cousins or you're around your siblings. And so that volume in the house is like normal. So coming to school, it's like learning how to tone that down. And I think a lot of times teachers do try to force it because I do think there's noise that is productive. And I understand there's a time and a place for everything. But I don't know. I think teachers should learn how to incorporate that into their teaching style and to be aware of that.
Yeah, so for me, I think there's no question on if education in school is catered towards white students. Yes, we can say white and Asian, but I definitely think it's more geared towards a European like education system. And I think facts don't lie. Like, so when we look at like students okay, so I work in education myself, and when I look at like the facts and I look at like standardized testing scores compared across the board, you see who's excelling, right? And it should tell you right then and there who education is geared towards, and it's not our Black and brown students, right? And I think a lot of what we're talking about now is even just how our own cultural backgrounds play inside of schools, right? So we're all used to running around our house, being loud, being free, being kind of what we were talking about last week, Black joy. What does that look like, right? And so we were having that inside of our own classroom spaces and being disciplined for it, right? So part of me is like I want to express who I am and be unapologetic about who I am, but I'm also being told not to. So I know education, like managing those spaces was hard for me, especially like Kayla and like Faith had said, I felt like the token Black kid at times, and even just being in spaces where not everybody looked like me. Luckily, Renton was pretty diverse, and I got to, see some diverse faces, but I didn't always go to diverse schools and I wasn't always in diverse places. But yeah, education is definitely not geared towards us.
I think like what comes to mind with me is kind of what Michael touched on. I think it's a cultural aspect, and not in the essence of behavioral issues, but just I can't, like, although I'm Black and Asian, I can't really speak to a Asian cultural aspect because I wasn't raised around that. But I know, generally speaking, of course, like always, in Black culture, schooling isn't a primary pillar for us. Like, I know for me, like, I'm literally the first person in my family to go to college, like cousins, uncles, every route you want to take. And it's not even about college. It's like a lot of my family didn't graduate from high school. It's just not a cultural thing for us where it's a primary objective or whatever you want to say. So I think it's one of those things where it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Was school based around these cultural aspects of the different races where they know Asian and whites, they hold school to a higher standard than we do of importance? Or was it based off was our cultural aspects, and sorry, I can't think right now, what we think is important, was it based off of what school deemed to be the norm of how you behave? And I can't answer that question, of course, because I don't think anybody can, but it definitely refers to like the cultural aspect of the different races.
And then I'll share just some of my thoughts, and then Ms. King, if you want to share any reflection or another question. So what I heard, like, it's interesting, like what you're mentioning, Adonis, because part of what you're saying is perhaps part of the reason why, and correct me if I'm hearing you wrong, but I heard you say something around like maybe the reason why Black kids specifically have a hard time in school is because that isn't a priority within family cultural backgrounds. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like I know a lot of like some of my close Asian friends. I've had like conversations where they have accounts about how they were raised specifically by their parents, to like even before they were in grade school, where they were taught how to behave in a classroom setting and how to abide and be submissive to a teacher, things like that. That's not implemented into a young Black kid's behavior and mannerisms. So it's like, I'm not saying Black people don't care about school, but it's definitely not like, that's not at the forefront of our like social and cultural behavior teachings. That's what I would say. Whereas with Asians, I would assume from my like perspective of what I've been told from Asian friends, a lot of them would say that's at the forefront of how they were raised. Like that's a prime setting of their life. But for us, it's not. And that's not a time scale thing. It's just like an importance thing.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that, and just off of hearing what Adonis said, for like I guess some recommendation or just like a word of advice to a teacher, I would just say just to keep in mind that it's like, just keep in mind that you're already kind of, as a teacher, at a bad advantage, just like any of the other students anyway, because I think schools become so normalized where it's like it tries to put everybody through like a one size fits all mode, and it's like teachers, especially in diverse areas, you gotta, you're dealing with a whole bunch of different types of personalities and everything. And just like Adonis was saying, most Black cultures and families, it's not really, they got other stuff to worry about. They're not really worried about focusing on school because they got something else going on at home. Whereas an Asian kid grew up to be raised, to excel in school, and school is probably the spot for him because he was raised up for that. But for most Black people, that's not the same. So I just think just really remember that you just gotta, as a teacher, you just gotta honestly just try to understand where your students are coming from just as much as you can. Really, just I wouldn't say understand because you will never really understand, but just know that it's they're not there just to sabotage your life. Like it already seems like the cards are already dealt kind of bad in the beginning. So just try to work as best as you can and work through that.
Just kind of some of my thoughts, having grown up in like a completely different culture of Iran initially, where school is very much so like sit down, be quiet, don't talk back. Like we used to get in trouble even if you like whistled in the class. And it's also like very structured in that way. But then when the teacher would leave the room, we were loud, and we like that was when we could be who we are. Culturally, we're not sit down and shut up type of people. And then when I came to the US, I went to schools that were predominantly white and Asian. And Newport High School was one of those schools where it was predominantly white and Asian. And kind of felt out of place myself. But like I knew the system and I went through it. And when I did my student teaching, I taught in schools in the Bellevue School District that were also predominantly white and Asian. And then I also taught in schools in the Renton School District. And then I had my own classroom at Renton High, where I had predominantly Black students, a few brown students, and maybe every once in a while some Asian and white students. And this is just like my experience and what I was taught from my students specifically, and some of you would be part of that teaching for me. I feel like, yes, I hear what you're saying as far as like maybe education is not the focus, but for me that didn't seem to be the main issue for why there was this disconnect with school and why kids were getting in trouble. From my experience, it wasn't so much like, I think because the way school systems are structured, from the beginning it was structured from a European white perspective, right? There's this tension constantly from the teacher and the student. And what I appreciated about my specifically Black students, specifically Black girls in my classrooms, was that they didn't let me get away with just saying whatever I wanted or just like wanting to be in charge and you do this because I said so. No, that was never part of our conversation. That would never fly. So it wasn't because I said so. My students listened to me because we had established a relationship. They listened to me because we genuinely, mutually cared about each other. And I think that's the conversation part that gets missed in schools all the time, is where sometimes we're trying to figure out, how do we solve this issue? How do we do this? But it's like, at the end of the day, I think there's cultures who thrive well with you step on whoever you need to step on to get to the top. You do whatever you need to do to make it. And then there are cultures, not just Black cultures, but there are cultures where it's about community. Because just like Michael also mentioned, we have a lot of cultures where your siblings are around, your grandparents are coming around, uncles, aunts, and it's about community. We respect each other because we have established the community, and that community aspect, that relationship part, is what's, I think, is always missing. So I've seen teachers who are very much so about sit down, be quiet, do this for me, and kids will do it without any battle because they have worked on that relationship piece for so long. And then I've seen teachers who really struggle with that, and it's a constant battle and it's a constant power struggle with the student and the teacher because there hasn't been a genuine established community. And I think that's the main part that I've noticed, and that's the difference that I've noticed in like my own classroom, is once that community established, then we can have the different modes of learning. But what's hard too is, I think sometimes we think about, I've had educators tell me, what's wrong with just sitting down and being quiet? That's the best way to learn. What about the other kids? What about the kids who can't focus if it's too loud? And my counter argument to that is, what about the kids who need to have more interaction? What about the kids who thrive when it's more interactive and thrive from being able to move around and thrive from being able to have those interactions? What about those kids, right? So I think there needs to be a balance. And like many of you shared too, it's not just about this one way, but that perfect balance.
I kind of want to expand off of what Adonis was saying too, where I think so much of it is about the shaping that goes in the home life, in terms of like culture. So when Adonis was talking about Asian families and how, from his anecdotal perspective, he was seeing his Asian friends who were pretty much coached for education, what like the sit down and be quiet model, right? And from my perspective, I could hear exactly what he was saying. Like that hit a note with me, because that was very much my personal experience growing up. And so in terms of community, I would almost dare say that with an Asian student, you don't have to, or a teacher would never have to earn any sort of right or build a community with an Asian student, because of the culture, which is very much, if an elder or someone in kind of a respected role, like an educator, if they tell you to do something, you do it, no questions asked. So, but this also brings me to Michael's point too, which I think is really interesting, because when Michael said, you'll never try to understand, but you won't ever really understand, I think that brings us to the core of the problem, which is when like a white teacher comes into the classroom, they're bringing in their whiteness into the classroom. Everything that they see is through their white lens. So when they a Black student or a brown student, it's not so much I see you, but where do you fit in terms of my whiteness, which is through this labeling that we're saying, which is like, you're too loud, you're disruptive, right? So I would almost dare say that in terms of advice, the advice would be maybe not try to understand, because Michael's right, you'll never understand, but just simply recognize that your lens is not the only lens. So that's where I would leave with that.
Yeah, that's very true. Adonis, I see you unmute yourself. Do you have thoughts to add to that?
It was just in response to what you were saying, because I know you said like your account was from a different perspective of what me and Michael said, but in my head, it kind of all came back to the same thing, because like I said, culturally, generally speaking, Asians they're taught to be abiding and submissive to a teacher, and that reflects the DNA of schooling. Like, so in order to get to the relationship community that you're speaking of, you're talking about changing the entire DNA aspect of what school is. Because what you were saying, especially, and I know this from just being raised around all Black women, like men aren't really a key figure in our lives as in terms of like who raises you. So what you're speaking of, how like especially your Black female students saying like, you need to respect me, you're not going to tell me what to do, this and that. That's a culture thing that's implemented in us, but it's a life thing that has nothing to do with school. That's how I walk around like every day on the street, and that's how I carry myself. So I wouldn't think it's like I said, it's really a culture thing. Yes, it's a community thing, but if you want to get to that, then you have to change the DNA of what school is and how it's ran. And there's something else I want to say. Oh, and what like Michael and Miss King was saying about the understanding thing. I think, yeah, understanding is really, of course, it's important, but I think that's something like, that's a way to chip away at the problem very slowly and tediously, because you have to do it a teacher at a time. Like, tell each teacher to understand and teach them how to understand, which is going to be a really long and tedious battle. Or you can just tell everybody, what I would assume to be easier is to just acknowledge things. like, because it's hard to understand, but it's not hard to acknowledge. You can even acknowledge the fact that you can never understand, and that will be enough to build a community and push things further. So I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah, that's super powerful. I agree. I think times when I've told students, look, when we start class, I just really need everybody to sit down. Like, it's really hard for me to just do this. And I know it's my thing and it's not your thing and it's just on me. Students have been like, okay, we get it. And so, like, we worked together. And that was when we were all sitting and quiet. I used to have a countdown. But then I also worked with students on times where things would get a little bit more loud and rowdy. And that was okay. I think just also working on our own discomforts as educators is really important, and recognizing, like, just because I'm uncomfortable, does that mean the situation is bad? Does that mean like there's no learning happening because this isn't the way I learned myself? And just being able to kind of push our own discomfort as educators is, I think, really important as well. But yeah, I think we do need to change the DNA of the way school is done, because it's not working for so many of our students. So that's part of this work.
Yeah, I teach at a predominantly white school, and on occasion I get a Black student in my class, and I mean occasionally. And sometimes I find myself doing the thing that I was describing before, where I'm looking at a kid through my Asian lens, which is sit down, be quiet, learn. And I'm finding more and more that I'm challenging myself. So I think Adonis is spot on with just, it starts with acknowledgement first, because I'm bringing my own culture, but my culture is not universal. And I think that's where we need to start, is my culture, like nothing is based off my culture. That would be, that's ethnocentric, right? To kind of consider mine as the default. And I think you're spot on, Adonis, where we just need to start at acknowledgement.